Our passages for today are extremely spiritual passages. They deal with retreats to the mountaintop, wondrous encounters with God's brilliance, shining reflections of God in one's face, a stunningly transformed Jesus. But I'll warn you right now, this sermon is going to be very, very human. It didn't start out this way. A week ago, as I started looking into this transfiguration story about Jesus, I found myself reflecting on the beauty of Jesus' mountaintop experience. Encountering God, hearing God's voice, transfigured with God's brilliance, speaking miraculously across time with Elijah and Moses, I started pondering how the scriptures time and again describe the presence of God with this language of radiance. The psalmist says of God, "You are clothed with honor and majesty, wrapped in light as with a garment." The prophet Habakkuk writes that God, the Holy One, has a brightness that was like the sun, and rays come forth from his hand. I thought about how this language of brilliance and brightness implies a God who is readily seen, perceived with directness and clarity, made boldly known rather than remaining shadowed and imperceptible. Yet, the experience of even those on the mountain is also of a God who remains shrouded in mystery inside a cloud. I wanted to know what to make of that tension between a God who is brilliant and a God who is clouded, and how it affects all of us who seek God. How can we learn to suspend all the barriers that inhibit our encounters with God, our disbelief, our doubt, our exhaustion, our fear of the truth-telling brightness of God? I wondered how we might reflect on the moments we have encountered God, how we might lean into spiritual experiences of God's brilliance, receive them when we come without trying to cling to them like Peter, how we might be strengthened by those glimpses of brilliance as we begin our journey into Lent, as we face the crosses of the world. I promise you, I wanted to take us up the mountain with Peter and James and John and Moses and meet the brilliant God who made us and loves us and sustains us. Then this week happened like a slowly unfolding descent down the mountain. First, through coughs and colds and rocking sick babies, in my experience. Then through urgent and mundane needs at home, at work, and of course, ultimately, through the awful reality of violence and war, whose latest iteration in Ukraine leapt into our consciousness and reminded us anew of the strife and suffering in the world of the valley. So this morning, I suppose I'm operating under the assumption that most of us are not up on the mountain. We are down in the valley. We are trying to balance prayer meetings, homework, emails, COVID rapid tests, home improvement, meal trains, and care for our neighbors, child care for aging parents, rapidly filling calendars, so many worthy causes. We are trying to grapple with a sense that the world has been completely knocked off its hinges politically, and yet also trying to return to normal as the Omicron wave subsides. And by the way, I know that not all of us are so sure about that. I see all the immunocompromised folks and folks with kids under 5. In all that, the radiance of God's glory is not so clear today. It's clouded up on that inaccessible mountain. God may have talked so closely with Moses on Mount Sinai that his face was transformed into a radiant brightness. God may have met and spoke with Jesus to equip him for the long desert wilderness. To equip him before he set his face to Jerusalem and to the cross. And Peter and James and John may also have been rewarded for hiking up a mountain and staying awake with that glimpse of glory but we do not seem to have been invited to that mountain in 2022. We seem to be among those Israelites waiting down in the valley, wondering how long the desert wilderness was going to last and where their leader was. Those Israelites who, when Moses came back, struggled to even look into that glory, asked him to wear a veil to temper the brilliance. We seem to have been among those disciples who were waiting down in the valley for Jesus, trying unsuccessfully to cast demons out of a young child. And by the way, those disciples in the valley have been busy. Let me walk you through their recent days. They've just returned from being sent out on mission by Jesus. They've been going throughout the villages of Galilee, healing, proclaiming the kingdom of God. They've been doing good and exhausting work. And ever since their return, they've been seeking a place to regroup and pray. First, they try a town called Bethsaida, but crowds follow them there, and they end up doing more healing and teaching. And then as the day draws to a close, they beg Jesus to send the crowd away into surrounding villages for food and lodging. And this is when Jesus famously refuses to send the crowd away and instead urges the disciples to take what they have, 5 loaves and 2 fish, and feed a crowd of 5,000 people. And I admit today I'm wondering, what if the disciples wanted to send the crowd away not just to get food, not just because they didn't think they had the capacity to feed them with 5 loaves and 2 fish, but also because it was a good stopping point, a chance to give everyone, including themselves, a break, at least till tomorrow. Anyhow, after that whole miraculous feeding, which, yes, it did end up being sort of exhilarating for them, but also exhausting, they try to withdraw again. Jesus takes them to a place to pray alone. And they're scarcely there that Jesus begins to foretell the coming rejection and cross that he and all who follow him will face. Not exactly a restful, restorative conversation either. This story, the Transfiguration story, the climbing the mountain story, follows on the heels of all of this. So to recap, it hasn't exactly been restful. Lots of good work to do in a world that needs a lot of healing and good news. Lots of hard news for the disciples to process. Lots of uncertainty about what's coming next. And lots of thwarted attempts to rest and pray and reconnect with God and just catch a break for once. Can you relate? It's why, even as I'm very glad that Peter, James, and John got a mystical vision of the holy, my heart goes out to the disciples who stayed on the ground. I imagine them down there when a man comes and asks them to heal his son, as they'd healed so many before. I imagine them exhausted, but agreeing to step in and do just one more good deed anyway. But then it's not working. What's going wrong? Why can't they cast out this demon? Why can't they heal this child? And why did some get invited up the mountain of Transfiguration to pray, while others were left down in the valley with the thankless tasks? They're getting frustrated. Where's Peter? He's really good at healing. Where's Jesus? He will know what to do. They're praying and hoping and waiting when Jesus emerges from that clouded place, that mountain of renewal that is cloaked in mystery. They're waiting and they hear the man say to Jesus, "I begged your disciples to cast out this spirit, but they could not." His frustration and distrust of them is understandable. It's true they have not been able to cast it out, but it's also slightly offensive because they've been trying really hard. And Jesus responds with one of those signature, strongly worded responses of his. "You faithless and perverse generation, how much longer must I be with you and bear with you?" Now, I know Jesus is coming down from a vision of glory, a meeting with his childhood heroes, Moses and Elijah, coming back to the shadows of the valley. But isn't it a bit harsh, Jesus? And who is he talking about? Who is the faithless and perverse generation? The disciples who've been trying to carry out the work he's commissioned them to do? The parent desperately longing for healing for his son? The crowd clamoring and demanding signs and miracles in hopes of seeing God's work break through the suffering? But the more I sit with it, the more I wonder if maybe the faithless and perverse generation isn't Jesus chastising any particular individual or group, but rather an exasperation at the continued suffering and sin and brokenness of the world of the valley. Jesus has just seen God's glory direct and piercing, just been reminded of where he's coming from, who he is. He's just heard the voice of love say, "This is my son, my chosen, listen to him." But down in the valley, the people's faces aren't shining with all that divine beauty. The listening to him isn't really happening. Fear, doubt, and desperation are winning the day. The cross is on the horizon. The powers of the world show no concern for the suffering, choosing instead to pad their own pockets, to deepen their own power and influence at any cost. Maybe the disciples could hear Jesus' words as words of solidarity, not of judgment. Jesus, too, is frustrated with the state of the world that should be, that could be much more like the kingdom of God, much more like the wonder and love and glory up on that mountain. If only it would follow God's ways, trust God's path. Anyhow, whatever the source of the disciples' inability to heal, and whatever the source of Jesus' exasperation, none of these things stop the power of God. None of these things stop Jesus from healing. He heals the boy. He heals the boy and gives him back to his father, and the gospel tells us simply, wrapping up a tumultuous turn of events rather quickly, that all were astounded at the greatness of God. I imagine a sort of hush falling over them, a peace that wasn't there when the disciples were desperately working to heal and the crowd was crying out in frustration and the boy was convulsing. Now there's quiet, and it may not last long because this isn't a mystical sight of a mountain. This is an on-the-ground, something else is always needed part of our lives. But it is a pause and a breath, and all were astounded at the greatness of God. Which is an interesting place to end this gospel story today. All the people have just seen the greatness of God right there in the frustrating valley, right there amidst the suffering, amidst the disciples' incapability to fight off the forces of evil alone, amidst the exhaustion, amidst all the questions and uncertainty. Up on the mountain was nice too. Peter and James and John definitely saw the greatness of God up there. Moses definitely communed with the greatness of God up there years ago. But the mountain was clouded. It was accessible only for a short time. They couldn't put tents up there. They couldn't stay up there. And now Jesus comes down from the clouded mountain, and when he comes, the brightness and brilliance of God makes its way into the valley too. Through healing and presence, Jesus transmits the brightness of God into the valley, into the thick of it. Jesus dwells among us. Jesus is God with us. Jesus is frustrated by the same sin and sorrow that frustrate all of us, and yet knows it doesn't snuff out God's glory. In the midst of housework, in the midst of mission work, in the midst of schoolwork, in the midst of relational work, in the midst of policy work, even in the midst of war. In the midst of whatever demons you're trying and failing to cast out, in the midst of days when you long to be the one going up the mountain, going back to long ago spiritual highs at a camp or retreat or anywhere. But you don't have to go up there to see God's glory. Jesus is here. And I think that truth may be both reassuring to those of us who can't seem to crack through the cloud today, but also frustrating. In the midst of a long, hard season, whenever that may come to us, it's not wrong to yearn for the mountaintop, to yearn to hear the voice of God, to see a brilliance that knocks our breath out of us. And sometimes we get that. But let's not forget that even when we don't get that, the central and radical claim of our Christian faith is that God doesn't stay up there on the mountain, clouded, where only a few can see. God comes right here in the person of Jesus. In fact, God collapses the mountain and the valley all together, collapses heaven and earth together. Jesus makes the valley bright with glory. So in your next moment, in my next moment, in anyone's next moment of frustration or worry or doubt, maybe we might take a moment, just a pause or a breath, and maybe we might perceive some of that brightness that Jesus offers right here, right now. May it be so.